Hey YouTubers, this is the Gold Standard Caesar 924 coming at you with a wrestling review for you guys today. But since Halloween's around the corner, I figured why not take this opportunity to go out my way and review a pay-per-view that WCW would hold every October from 1989 to 2000. And as you can read up the title of the screen, this is going to be my review for WCW Halloween Havoc. And the year that I'll be reviewing will be from the year 1997. Now, this took place in the Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. And overall, I gotta say, this was actually a really fun show, in my opinion. And it was actually a pretty stacked card, 8 matches. And even though you do have some matches that kind of leave you scratching your head, but I'll get a little more into those particular matches as the video rolls along. Now, WCW in 1997 could arguably be the best year that WCW has had in terms of storytelling and as far as the emphasis on in ring match performances are concerned. WCW, ever since it had been purchased by Ted Turner, it would lead to a lot of key significant events that would turn around the company from a average southern based wrestling promotion into the hottest number one promotion in professional wrestling all across the world. It definitely really showed once you get to the mid 90s when WCW started plucking in a bunch of top tier talents from most notably their rival company from up north, that being WWF or WWE as we know it now, with guys like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and then later on we would get to guys like Diesel and Razor Ramon, who would be known as Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, respectively. Then you also had the influx with international wrestlers that were just coming on board. The Cruiserweight division was born. Guys like Rey Mysterio, Ultimo Dragon, Dean Malenko, Chris Jericho, Juventud Guerrera, Psychosis. Just a plethora of these young international professional wrestlers that were already competing in various promotions all across the globe, particularly Japan and Mexico. And it definitely showed just how diverse WCW was and how revolutionary the promotion had been throughout the mid to late 90s. Now, there was also another particular storyline that had been going on that should be mentioned because it's a huge part in as to why WCW was mainly financially successful in the first place, that being the hostile takeover of the New World Order. As we all know, the New World Order, a stable that had been formed during the summer of 1996, Hall and Nash start provoking a war with WCW, which leads to this hostile takeover match that would take place at Bash at the Beach 96. Hulk Hogan comes out there and shows his true colors, revealing himself to be the leader of the New World Order. He shocks the world. I mean, he was a huge baby face, a huge superhero for children to look up upon, someone that they would idolize in terms of professional wrestling. And just to see him go over to the dark side was just something that at the time not a lot of people saw coming. So for then onwards, Hulk Hogan ditched off the red and yellow that he had been known for wearing in favor of black and white clothing, which would be a signature color for the New World Order. And they would continue their reign of terror, just terrorizing the WCW locker room, and they would always, take over the commentating booth. I mean, they would even occasionally take over shows, and even having their own pay-per-view earlier that year with Sold Out. And the New World Order was, something that was very revolutionary for its time. And to see all these WCW wrestlers, whether you were a babyface, whether you were a heel, just to see them kind of all come together to fight this common foe, that being the NWO, just trying to take over their turf and will do whatever it takes to put a nail in the coffin to Southern wrestling. And it was such a hot storyline that really propelled WCW to new heights that the company had never been in before. And they would continue to dominate for 84 weeks, 1996 to 1998. And so the NWO had been continuing to run rampage in WCW for the next year and a half. So we get to Halloween Havoc 1997, and the show opened up with a match involving Ultimo Dragon and Yuji Nagata. Now, Ultimo Dragon had been a huge part in the Cruiserweight division. He's held the Cruiserweight title for two occasions by this point. And Yuji Nagata, he would be accompanied by Sonny Ono, who had previously been Ultimo Dragon's manager, but at some point had betrayed Ultimo Dragon in favor of managing Yuji. And this was actually a really fun match overall. Just a nice blend of mat-based wrestling with occasional high-flying acrobatics. And it was actually a really fun match overall. It wasn't necessarily like a match that was like built up heavily, like this is personal. We see two of the wrestlers just countering each other with submission holds, and they managed to escape. Yuji Nagata ended up defeating Ultimo Dragon with the Fujiwara armbar. And it was actually a really solid TV style match. Definitely really enjoyed two of those wrestlers. I mean, Ultimo Dragon also. I mean, not only was he cruiserweight champion, but he'd been a J Crown winner, wrestling all around the globe, particularly in Japan. But definitely made a name for himself overseas. And it's such a huge accomplishment at the time because the J Crown was the crowning, I believe, in New Japan. It was a unification of 8 different championship belts. And it was, for the time, I mean, it was such a huge accomplishment. I mean, something that was very uncommon in, professional wrestling and something that was somewhat of unheard of here in the States. So it was definitely a huge accomplishment, to bring in a wrestler like Ultimo Dragon here in WCW. And Mike Tenay would be the announcer, not only just play by play, but also provide some insight regarding these international wrestlers. Basically, explain to them who they are and the championships and the accomplishments that they made over the years and their character overall. So I really enjoyed, having someone like a journalist like Mike Tenay. I mean, though he would have his success in TNA as well, but when I watched him in WCW, I mean, he was. I really liked him especially in this company and in this particular role. Basically, trying to put these young talents over. And same applies with the new Yuji Nagata. Also another international wrestler that also wrestled in Japan as well. But nevertheless, I definitely really enjoyed this match. Now we get to another unadvertised match that was announced here, and this involved Chris Jericho taking on Gedo. Now, Gedo was also another wrestler like Yuji Nagata that I'm not necessarily too familiar with, but I think we all know who, Chris Jericho is and especially how big of a star that he would end up becoming in the years to come. But yeah, this was also another match that I enjoyed as well, and Jericho went over Gedo in a pretty short match, but it was also a pretty watchable match as well. Now, I was watching the WWE Network, and I noticed that he was coming out to the iconic Break the Walls Down entrance theme that he had been known for in WWE and still uses it to this day. But I'm thinking that might have been sort of like license issue in terms of the music. And Jericho actually came out to a low budget version of Pearl Jam's Even Flow, which was a theme that you could pretty honestly tell that, WCW, when it came to some of the custom made entrance themes that they would produce, just felt very low key and just kind of like a complete parody of the real music that was performed by the actual band, that being Pearl Jam. Now, that wouldn't be the only entrance music that WCW would use in terms of having to utilize similar mainstream music and incorporating into like a modified version, even going out their way to water it down. They also had DDP coming out to a weird version of Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. They had Raven come out to Come As You Are. I'm pretty sure there were other ones, like Jeff Jarrett coming out to Kid Rock's Cowboy, but it was kind of like a weird instrumental version of it. But that was like years later, though. But I digress. But getting in the match, it wasn't necessarily that bad, but Jericho did, however, go over Gedo. I really like that Lion Tamer finishing move that he used to do. I mean, it was kind of like a more devastating version of the Walls of Jericho, where it's like a Boston Crab that he normally does, but instead Jericho kneels down on the back of his opponent's neck while he's locking in that Boston Crab. If you're familiar with some of the older WCW games for the N64, or even in the WWE games with WrestleMania 2000, No Mercy, it's basically kind of like that. Just Chris Jericho just locks in the Boston Crab, but he kind of elevates his opponent and puts his knee on the back of his opponent's neck. But yeah, I mean, this was a pretty solid TV style match for what it was. But then we get to one of the best, if not the best match of the night. And this was the Cruiserweight title versus mask match involving the champion Eddie Guerrero defending the belt against Rey Mysterio. There was just a lot of mix of technical and lucha libre wrestling and just all around a fast-paced match that really glues you at the edge of your seat. Some really cool spots. Rey Mysterio doing a plancha, and Eddie Guerrero just coming off as a heel and utilizing some dirty tactics. Now, Rey Mysterio would go over Eddie Guerrero in that match. I believe Eddie Guerrero tried to go for a Black Tiger Bomb, which was something that he used to do when he was Black Tiger. But he would do it in WCW on a number of occasions, but his finisher being the Frog Splash. Eddie Guerrero tried to do a Black Tiger Bomb from the top rope, and then Rey Mysterio at the last moment just counters that into a Hurricane Rana to get the 3 count in order to not only keep his mask intact, but also he won the Cruiserweight title in the process. So it was actually a really fun match overall. Now, these next batch of matches aren't necessarily noteworthy to write home about, but these matches involve Steve McMichael taking on Alex Wright, as well as the intergender bout between Jacqueline taking on Disco Inferno. Now, as far as Steve McMichael and Alex Wright are concerned, originally this was going to be Mongo taking on Jeff Jarrett. This had been a boiling rivalry that had been going on throughout most of 1997. At some point on a pay-per-view, Jarrett and Mongo had a match in which Debra betrayed Steve McMichael and subsequently siding along with Jeff Jarrett before, or at least until Jarrett had left the company that month. So instead, they had Alex Wright to take over the mantle as Steve McMichael's opponent. And so the match wasn't necessarily anything memorable. Towards the end of the match, they had interference from Goldberg, who would come out and spear Steve McMichael, allowing Alex Wright to pick up the victory. Now, it's actually pretty interesting just to see Goldberg, especially at the spot that he was in at the time. He was just debuting with the company just shortly around this time. I think, yeah, he debuted in September. So he would make his first pay-per-view appearance here, but he wasn't announced to wrestle in the match on this pay-per-view. It's definitely interesting, even looking in hindsight, to think that Goldberg went from interfering in a random undercard match involving Alex Wright, of all people, and then a year later, not only would he be on top of the food chain as far as the main event scene is concerned, but he would also be World Heavyweight Champion, headlining the following year's Halloween Havoc against Diamond Dallas Page. And Goldberg is definitely the one of the prime examples of what a year of difference makes. And just to imagine, or just looking back, even in hindsight, to think that Goldberg would end up being the hottest thing going in professional wrestling, and particularly in WCW. Mongo loses the match thanks to interference from Goldberg, and so Goldberg obtains the super ring that Steve McMichael had, since he once played for the Chicago Bears, and Goldberg actually was another football athlete who played for the Atlanta Falcons. So they would have a program that would go on a few months later that would build up into a match that they would have at Starrcade. But the McMichael Alex Wright match wasn't anything too memorable. It was a match that you would see on like Nitro or Saturday Night. But then we get to Jacqueline taking on Disco Inferno. Like McMichael and Alex Wright, this wasn't really too much of a match that I would really recommend in any way. But it's just kind of like a light-hearted, goofy match. And it kind of drags along in some places. But Jacqueline ended up winning the match against Disco Inferno via roll-up. So, I mean, it's just another match that wasn't a match that would be taken seriously. Jacqueline would go over Disco Inferno. Now we get to the United States Championship bout. Curt Hennig going as the champion, taking on Ric Flair. Now this stems from the Fall Brawl War Games match that both of them were involved in. Now they were part of the Four Horsemen. They were taking on the NWO with Syxx, Kevin Nash, Buff Bagwell, and Conan. At some point, Hennig turns on the Horsemen, sides along with the NWO. Hennig slams Ric Flair's head using the cage fence door. So Flair had been taken out of action for the next several weeks. So Flair is out for retribution, taking his frustrations, the matter on his own hands to take on the traitor. So he goes after Curt Hennig, who is now part of the NWO. This was actually a pretty disappointing match. I mean, this was a lot of brawling back and forth, so in some ways it was understandable. I mean, it's not a technical classic like they had a couple years prior. I believe they had a match on Raw in 1993, but then you fast forward 4 years later, and both of these guys are in WCW, and yeah, there was definitely something very off about this match. I mean, there was a lot of brawling back and forth here and there, and I can understand what they were trying to go with. You know, Flair coming in, starting off hot, and the match did seem pretty promising at first. The match ended in a disqualification. Flair had Curt Hennig tied in a tree of woe. Flair wraps the United States Championship belt around Curt Hennig and stomps on it in order to get a DQ. So Hennig retains the title and wins the match as a result of disqualification. This match just never really. It wasn't a match that kind of disappointed, and definitely not on par with some of the previous encounters that they had. They did have another match they had at World War III, and they were supposed to have a rubber match at Starrcade, which would be contested inside a steel cage. But unfortunately, Flair wasn't able to wrestle, so that cage match got aborted. So there wasn't necessarily a conclusion to their program, which seemed to be kind of a problem when it comes to WCW, is that they start off a feud and they just don't finish. And that was kind of one of the prime examples of a feud that was going on between Flair and Hennig. But it's just really a shame, because I think Hennig could have been a great Four Horseman, and I don't necessarily think they had to have him side with the NWO. Yeah, nevertheless, this match was pretty disappointing. And the match we have is Lex Luger taking on Scott Hall. Now, this kind of also stems from Fall Brawl in a tag team match. Luger and Scott Hall on opposite sides. Larry Zbysko, who comes out there and makes a ref count, even though he wasn't the official referee at the time. The next several Nitros, there was a lot of bickering back and forth between Larry Zbysko and Scott Hall. And Zbysko would be on, commentary because by this point he had already retired. So he would normally commentate the first hour of Nitro, and Scott Hall would 9 times out of 10 would chime in by the commentator's booth and try to pick on Larry Zbysko, and even Eric Bischoff also got involved at some point as well. So this kind of stems in a one-on-one bout between Luger and Scott Hall with Larry Zbysko as the special referee. Now, the match did get restarted, and originally what happens is that Syxx, who was accompanying Scott Hall, he helps Scott Hall win the match. He attacks Lex Luger while Zbysko is distracted. So this allowed Scott Hall to nail the outsider's edge to initially pin Lex Luger for the 3 count until Zbysko decided to replay the footage and thus restarting the match, which allowed Luger to take the advantage, winning via torture rack where Scott Hall submitted. And so there was an ongoing brawl that ensues post-match. So this match was just kind of a bit of a clusterfuck, especially with the false finishes and whatnot. When you see very shenanigans interfering in the match, normally when you find that a wrestler wins the match via using underhanded tactics whatsoever, a lot of the times they would just kind of just move on from there. But this was something that was kind of uncommon, especially just to have a referee just convincing to replay the footage of some outside interference of a match that causes a wrestler to lose and stuff. So I thought that was kind of something that was, I don't know if I want to say a plot hole in terms of Wrestling 101 when it comes to wrestlers or outside interference and costing certain wrestlers a match only to restart the match. So that was just very uncommon just to see that, especially in all the years I've been watching professional wrestling. So Luger wins the overall match despite the false finish and whatnot. Now, next we have is the Last Man Standing, or Las Vegas Sudden Death match, as WCW called it. But yeah, basically it's a Last Man Standing match, and this involves DDP taking on Randy Savage. Definitely a really enjoyable match. Definitely the feud that really brought Diamond Dallas Page and really made him the star that he ended up becoming. Just a lot of brawling in the crowd, and even they fought at the entrance stage where they utilized some of the props that were presented throughout the Halloween Havoc sets, like the graveyards, a tombstone. There was just a lot of chaos going on just all around the arena. So the match continued onwards, and eventually a fake Sting ambushes DDP from behind, which allows Savage to win via the 10 count. Yeah, Savage wins the overall feud. It's definitely a really entertaining match, and the feud that really brought DDP his A game and even brought Savage his A game. So it was definitely a great feud. Now we get to a steel cage match with Roddy Piper taking on Hollywood Hogan. Even though Hogan was the world champ at the time, unfortunately the title belt was not defended, which kind of shocked me the first time I watched it. I was like, when Piper beat Hulk Hogan in the main event, I was like, yes, Piper won. And then next thing you know, you realize that the title belt wasn't even on the line. So I was like, damn. But, I mean, the match was pretty horrendous, I'll be honest. I mean, even on paper, you would think this match would be like the greatest thing that you would get. But yeah, Piper and Hogan have been kind of feuding throughout the years, even in WWE. and then they reignite their feud in WCW once Piper made his WCW debut the previous year's Halloween Havoc. So it kind of goes all full circle, which makes sense in a way. Piper beat Hogan at Starrcade, which, like in this particular pay per view, the title belt wasn't on the line. However, the title belt would be defended at Super Brawl, which Hogan retained under some screwy finishes. So they do have the penultimate match, which would be having Piper and Hogan being confined inside the steel cage to, avoid all the NWO members to try and interfere in the match. Now, interesting enough is that around this time, even a couple weeks prior, was that WWF was holding a pay-per-view, which was In Your House Bad Blood, which would be synonymous for being the first ever Hell in a Cell match. So it seemed like they were trying to capture that essence of that match. As far as the steel cage, it's kind of more of the Thunder Cage, where Piper and Hogan can fight outside the ring as opposed to just really being inside the ring at all times. So the rules were just kind of very iffy in a way because they couldn't like climb over the cage and then they automatically win the match. But here it was kind of like you have to win by pinfall or submission. The way they structured this match, even going into it, was just very weird. And it seemed like they were trying to capture the essence of Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. Piper and Hogan even fought on top of the cage when they were climbing up there. I mean, even Macho Man tried to do a pretty, like a high spot using the elbow and assaulting Roddy Piper. I mean, they even, not only did they fight outside the ring, but they also fought outside the cage, much like Shawn Michaels and Undertaker did. But they didn't, with Piper and Hogan, they just kind of lack the intensity that when WWE tried to do it in the Hell in a Cell match, which was the inspiration from the Thunder Cage match that they actually used for WCW. Like WCW was trying to do it in their own way. Piper did, however, go over Hogan with the sleeper hold in order for Piper to go over. But unfortunately, because the title wasn't on the line, so Hogan's still the champ. Yeah, this match was just very convoluted, and even you had like a bunch of like some run-in by the fans in the crowd. So I thought it was like, even when I was watching it, it was like, what are these guys doing? But I thought it was like all like a work. But then I realized, okay, this is just way too much. Overall, I mean, Halloween Havoc, especially in '97, I mean, it was a pretty solid show. I think there were a couple other matches that were on here that kind of prevent it from being an all-time great. But there were also some. I think there were some good to great matches that were on here that kind of keeps you satisfied. So it's not completely bad. I definitely really enjoyed this show. Aside from a couple stinkers here, check out the Last Man Standing match with DDP and Randy Savage, the Cruiserweight title versus mask match between Eddie and Rey Mysterio, the first two matches with Ultimo Dragon, Yuji Nagata, as well as Chris Jericho and Gedo. But Halloween Havoc '97, it was a pretty solid enough show. Definitely worth my time watching, and I honestly don't have any regrets watching it. But let me know what your guys' thoughts are in the comment section below. Tell me what your thoughts are regarding this pay-per-view event. Thank you all guys for watching. And until then, this is the Gold Standards User 924 signing out.